Hello and welcome everybody. I'm excited for today's event on carbon pricing in the real world. I'm Jesse Jenkins at the Andlinger Center for Energy and Environment at Princeton University and with the Department of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering. And on behalf of Princeton's Andlinger Center and our partners for this event at the Niskanen Center and our co-sponsors at the Environmental Defense Fund and the Center for Policy Research in Energy and Environment at Princeton School of Public and International Affairs, thanks everyone for attending. I wanted to give a bit of an introduction to this event before handing things over to our panelists and moderators. We've got a great hour and a half or so in store for you today. And I was motivated to put together this event by the publication of Danny Cullenward and David Victor's recent book, Making Climate Policy Work, which landed on my doorstep around the winter break, and which offers a cogent and constructive critique of how carbon pricing policies work in practice across the world. Carbon pricing could be the most powerful tool in our climate policy arsenal. By putting a price on carbon pollution that's equal to the societal damages caused by an additional ton of climate warming carbon dioxide, policymakers can provide incentives that reach all corners of our economy and incentivize decisions by businesses and consumers to consider the economic costs of climate change in all of their decision making. By internalizing the cost of carbon emissions in this way, and by which could be implemented either through a carbon tax or through emissions cap and permit trading programs, is widely regarded as the least expensive and most market-friendly way to drive down greenhouse gas emissions and confront the threat posed by climate change. There's only one catch. Governments around the world consistently fall short in their efforts to price carbon. Danny and David's new book offers a look across the world's experiences with carbon pricing and provides a useful diagnosis of the real-world challenges that carbon pricing faces in practice, and I think a constructive set of recommendations for how we can do better going forward. So I'm excited to welcome our first panel, which will include Danny and David. And then we're going to have some further discussion later on by Suzi Kerr, Chief Economist at the Environmental Defense Fund, and Joe Majkut of the Niskanen Center, who are going to offer a more proactive or positive spin in their experiences working through policymaking channels to try to implement carbon pricing. So to briefly introduce our first panel, Danny Cullenward is an energy economist and lawyer working on the design and implementation of scientifically grounded climate policy. He's the policy director at Carbon Plan, a lecturer at Stanford Law School, and a member of California's Independent Emissions Market Advisory Committee, where he's had a front row seat to the implementation and administration of California's greenhouse gas cap and trade program. He holds a JD and PhD in environment and resources from Stanford University. David Victor is a professor of industrial organization and innovation at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at the University of California, San Diego, where he also holds numerous courtesy appointments, reflective of his work at the intersection of energy, climate change, politics, and policy. His research focuses on regulated industries and how regulation affects the operation of major energy markets and their impact on climate change. He's the author of several books on international climate policy and politics, each of which is required reading in my view, and he's a fellow alumni of MIT, where he earned a PhD in political science. I'm going to hand things over for the rest of this event to our august moderator today, Robert Keohane, an emeritus professor of international affairs at Princeton University. He's the author of After Hegemony, Cooperation and Discord in the World Political Economy, among many other important works in the fields of international relations and international politics. Professor Keohane is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Philosophical Society, and the National Academy of Sciences, as well as a corresponding member of the British Academy. I'm going to hand things over to Bob now to moderate our first event, our first portion of the panel, and just want to note that we are going to be taking questions from each of you via the Q&A portion of the Zoom features here. I'll be monitoring those and passing things along to our discussants. And with that, I'll hand things over to Professor Keohane.
Thank you, Jesse. It's a great pleasure to be here. David is an old friend, and I know Danny as well as Suzi. So it's a good event because we are not debating whether climate change is real, and we're not debating whether to do something about it. We're having a more serious debate on what to do about it and how large a role carbon prices should play. The National Academies of Sciences issued a recent report in February, which I recommend to all of you, which is kind of ambivalent about carbon prices. So it sets the stage for this debate. They say, yes, there should be a carbon price of $40 a ton, but they don't put emphasis on it. And the chair of that panel, Stephen Fakala, in introducing it, indicated that all of the recommendations he thought could be fulfilled without a carbon price. So that it's a carbon price, but it's not essential to. So they're kind of on the fence about this, which indicates that this is a topic which is a live topic that divides people who are otherwise on the same side of most issues, who are serious policy analysts studying climate change in a sustained way. So we'll start with David Victor and Danny Cullenward, and David's going to speak first, and then Danny.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Bob and Jesse and Princeton and all of your affiliates for the invitation. It's really terrific to be with you here today. And I think the introductions that both of you made really set up the question in front of us, which is it's easy as a political scientist to explain pessimism around climate change and the lack of action. But the reality right now is there's a lot happening, and more could be happening, a lot of technological progress. And so the question right now for us analysts is which policy instruments really move the needle? There's been the literature for the most part has been around what do things cost, what is technological feasibility, all important questions. But ultimately, serious climate policy requires putting together and holding together a political coalition. And that's what this book is about. It's about the politics of instrument choice, of policy instrument choice. We're very focused on, throughout the book, on market instruments of two flavors: cap and trade systems, so quantity measures, carbon taxes, price measures, because the empirical experience is mostly around cap and trade. The core of the book is a lot about that, but we're also going to have some observations about carbon taxes and also, frankly, how to make cap and trade systems a little more tax-like, because the politics of that are easier. What's new in this study is a theory of politics and attention to political behavior. And what's also new is empirics. There's been enough experience now with market-based instruments that we can lay out some basic theories about how the world works politically, and then see whether the actual experience with market-based instruments survives contact with that theory. And that's what we're gonna be dealing with today. So here's a picture of the book, which is available on Amazon. So we can send money to Jeff Bezos if you're interested in buying the book. And then I want to just go straight to the next slide, which sets up the puzzle that we're going to carry through the presentation today. What you see on the left side is World Bank data showing since 1990 the fraction of global emissions year by year that come from jurisdictions that have carbon market systems in one form or another. And since the middle 2000s, that fraction has risen, with in particular with the arrival of the European Emissions Trading Scheme and then systems in California, the northeastern states, the so-called RGGI systems. This year we have rolling out in kind of haphazard ways the Chinese system. So now you have this big rise in the role of market-based instruments, and it seemed, and at the same time, a lot more action on climate change. So it would look on the surface that the use of market-based instruments coincides with policy action. What you see on the right side, though, are the actual price levels. So about 85% of world emissions currently have effectively no price. Right above that, you see the price levels that are consistent with the RGGI system in the Northeast, so less than $10 a ton. Above that, you see price levels consistent with what we have in California, $17, $18 a ton. You have the European levels above that, and you have 0.3% of global emissions have a price that's above $50 a ton. So that's a pretty big puzzle, which is we see a huge use of market-based instruments, but when you look closely at the actual price levels, it's nothing like the social cost of carbon. And frankly, also, it's nothing like what societies are actually spending when you go look at the cost of the policy measures like renewable portfolio standards, energy efficiency measures, a variety of other things that real governments run by politicians that need to hold on to power that they've been putting into place. And so that's the the big puzzle that we're trying to explain throughout this book. Our explanation that we offer is through a lens of political behavior. And it's not just kind of politics is hard and so on, but we're trying to provide a systematic explanation for the political behavior that we observe. In the book, we look at institutions. So institutions aggregate interests and make decisions, and the voting rules in institutions matter and so on. And then we also look at 5 major interest groups, or organized, potentially organized interest groups, of which 3 do most of the work. We look at incumbent emitting industries. They're very well organized. They know who they are because they already exist, and they know what the consequences might be of policies that change the status quo. They're typically very powerful. We look at voters, which for the most part tend not to be that well organized around climate policy, especially in opposition to climate policy, except in a few sectors where climate policy has visible effects, like in transportation fuels, where people know to the decimal point what the cost of gasoline is and how it might change as a result of climate and other kinds of policies. We look at political leaders who are democratically responsive and are often playing pioneering roles in creating markets. My former governor, Jerry Brown, for example. Civil society, organized civil society, we look at in the book. Most organized civil society, think NGOs, is not that heavily engaged with carbon markets. Joe's organization, Suzi's organization are among the few exceptions. And then look at emerging low carbon industries, which tend, frankly, not to be that well organized and focused on carbon markets, because if you're a fledgling new industry, you're much more interested in direct subsidy or market support or market access than some abstract, ephemeral and distant impact of a gradually rising carbon price into the future. So what we think is that these first 3 interest groups do a huge amount of the work in explaining what happens, what we observe empirically in the real world with this now huge experience with using market-based instruments to try and address the climate change problem. And over the next few minutes, Danny and I are going to talk about 4 observations. There are many more in the book, but 4 observations to kind of help give you a sense of what our core argument is. And the first observation is that one of the reasons, if not the central reason, why prices are so low is that the organized interest groups, incumbents, are often opposed to policies that alter the status quo, but their power becomes much greater when that opposition is also magnified by other interest groups such as voters. And so you see in essentially every market we've observed in the real world, you see what we call Potemkin markets. After the fabled czarist villages where you take the czar out to show how beautiful the construction project has been and so on, as long as nobody looks behind the facade, it all looks like the facade is beautiful, or in our case, that the market is actually doing the work. This is a Shutterstock image that Dave Roberts included in his Volts newsletter, the 3-part series about the book. For cap and trade systems, this problem is particularly severe, because in every market that has a cap and trade system, most of the emission reductions are being implemented through regulatory policy instruments, direct action, industrial policy, a handful of other things, and not the market-based instruments. Think that the cap and trade system, in effect, is trading a residual. You have other policies like renewable portfolio standards that cause emission reductions, and then whatever's left over gets traded as a residual. And so the prices that come out of the cap and trade system don't, in fact, reflect the real marginal effort that is being made by firms there. There's been a whole series of empirical studies that have now looked at this, among others, Severin Bornstein's recent piece in the American Economic Review, and a lot of other research, and we present a lot of that in the book. So this is a huge problem, and one of the things we grapple with in the book is does this exist because policymakers were asleep in Economics 101 when they were learning about externalities? And if they only learned more economics, or we yelled louder as policy analysts, would they do something differently? And we think they weren't asleep. We think they were wide awake. They knew what they saw. And from a political point of view, a lot of what we love about markets, transparency, fungibility across different sectors, the ability for the market to find out how to allocate costs and benefits, that's a horror show for politicians who want to put together and hold together political support for a policy instrument. And so that's why they favor direct intervention and regulations, because you can manage the politics of that much more easily. This same challenge exists for carbon tax instruments. One of the good examples of that is Norway, which has one of the highest tax environments in the world. And yet the most important pioneering carbon capture and storage project that's being developed right now in the Norwegian market is a project, the Northern Lights project, that could not be justified on carbon tax grounds alone. It required direct and substantial support from the Norwegian government and the European government. So we see this pattern all around the world, this Potemkin markets pattern that is the core explanation for why prices are low, even as governments are making significant efforts. And I want to underscore that the book that we've written is not an anti-market book. Danny and I are both trained in that discipline. It's a book that's trying to look at whether the ideas, the elegant ideas of using market-based instruments can work in the real political world, where there are organized forces that often want to keep your policy from being effective. And a key part of politics is managing the incidence of the costs and benefits around groups that otherwise could completely block your policy. Another thing we spend a lot of time in the book discussing is the coverage of different sectors. And the different interest groups that are relevant for climate policy are organized in different ways in different sectors. And so one way to think about this is, on the vertical axis is the extent to which there's a demand for a policy response, the extent to which actors are organized, they have the capacity to block policy. Where you see transportation fuels at the absolute top, we think the transportation fuel problem is in some sense one of the hardest, because the public in much of the world is so attentive to the cost of transportation fuels. Electric power sector, in the bottom right, is the opposite. It's not that the incumbents in the power sector are indifferent to the cost of policy, but it's that government also has the capacity to adjust the incidence of costs on those different groups in ways that keep the politics together. And that's the horizontal axis, is think of this conceptually as the size of the toolkit available to policymakers to respond to politically well-organized groups. In the power sector, the toolkit's really large, think direct regulation, tariffs, and so on. The transportation area, the toolkit is much smaller, but for the capacity to simply remove or water down the policy. And this is why cap and trade systems or tax systems that link together multiple sectors, when you follow the advice of good market design, often end up stuck with prices that are extremely low, because the politics of the least ambitious sector, the transportation fuel sector, end up driving the politics of the system overall. One of the ways you can test this theory is to go out into the real world and look at the actual incidence of carbon prices, which is what we show on the next slide. Using an amazing data set that Jeffrey Dolphin, originally at Cambridge University, put together that looks at the carbon price sector by sector for all of the economies that have market-based instruments in place. If the nominal carbon price, or the price that's in the law, or the price that comes out of the market, were applied to all sectors, then you'd be on the 45-degree line showed in the dotted gray lines there. But instead, what you see is the economy-wide average price is much, much lower, because there are sectors that are fully exempted from carbon pricing, or pricing levels are reduced precisely because those sectors are politically very exposed. Think, for example, the Swedish steel industry, where you have the highest carbon tax in the world, across the Swedish nominal carbon tax in the world, and yet the steel sector is exempted from the vast majority of that, because Swedish steel could not compete in the global commodity market, if it didn't have that kind of exemption. And so this is the real world of politics, and one of the ways you see this is in the actual prices that the economy experiences, as opposed to the idealized theoretical prices, which is where we tend to focus a lot of our research, hopefully our research until now. So I want to hand it over now to Danny, who's going to do a deep dive and look at the situation in California, where you can really see this difference across different sectors, and the data are particularly rich. Danny?
Thanks, David, and thank you to Jesse and to our discussants, Joe and Susie. Really appreciate the chance to be with you all. So I wanted to show you a picture that brings together a number of the concepts David's just talked about. And I think California is probably the place where the data are richest and allow us to speak most clearly about these issues in a comprehensive manner. So I'm showing you a number of policy measures that the state of California pursues on climate policy. And on the left-hand side, you see our cap and trade program, which covers about 3/4 of the state's emissions. It covers all three of the sectors David just discussed. And as a result, the politics are very, very difficult to move this system to a higher ambition, higher price outcome. You've seen prices stuck basically at an administratively determined price floor for the market's entire history, currently $17, $18 a ton. When you start to look at individual sectors in California, you see a very different story. California has a famously ambitious renewable portfolio standard, and after Hawaii was the second state to push for 100% clean electricity in a major bill that followed actually a very contentious bill to extend the cap and trade program and help perpetuate these politics that we've been talking about. California's renewable portfolio standard, when you measure the cost effectiveness, you measure the cost of carbon that's being reduced, we're pushing a lot harder on that, and we're on the direction of moving into a zero grid implementation pathway. Arguably because you're looking at a single sector where the politics are easier to organize, the public perception around the benefits of moving to clean energy easier, and the cost implications simpler for policymakers to manage, although by no means a simple matter, as Jesse and others know. We see similar examples. Actually, I think maybe the most important and prominent one is in California's low carbon fuel standard, which is actually itself a carbon pricing program that applies to just a single sector, to transportation fuels that are sold in the state. And that program trades at around $200 a ton these days. What's so interesting about this policy is that if you go look around the world at a lot of the people who are pursuing some of the most aggressive climate mitigation strategies, including direct air capture, as well as some of the efforts to develop negative emissions or carbon capture and storage facilities in California, everybody's looking at the LCFS as a primary means of financing these breaking edge technologies because it delivers such a high price signal that's so valuable. It helps bring new technologies to market, almost an order of magnitude higher costs, I guess a little bit more than you see with the overall economy-wide cap and trade program. And you see results that are very, very different because it has such an ambitious price trajectory. When you take a step back, California is about to go through a scope and plan process to think about how it's going to achieve its carbon neutrality goals by mid-century and how to achieve a legally binding 2030 emissions limit. The last time the state did this, it looked at a portfolio of policies, many of them significantly more expensive than the cap and trade program, in no small part because they're also much more ambitious and a range of costs up to $200 a ton as well there. When you open up the hood on the spending side of these programs, which is something very few people have done, particularly in the context of political thinking around carbon pricing, you see an even wider range of outcomes. Now, some of the spending is what I think ungenerously you would call pork. Pork is a big part of how political systems operate, and we shouldn't run away screaming from it. But you often see some of the expenditures targeting really ambitious and beneficial activities. You also see interest groups scrambling to label their preferred expenditures green and to sort of come in under the line in that sort of way. So you see a wide variety of outcomes in terms of the effective carbon pricing that's in place. And this macro economy-wide cap and trade program sort of sits on top of it and creates the mirage that we're using a market-based approach when in fact we're driving our progress with very different strategies and techniques. California is not alone in that, and we think is typical of the politics that we talk about in this book. The reason California stuck on low prices on cap and trade is if you want to adjust the program to make it do a bigger share of California's climate policy agenda, you're going to raise transportation fuel prices. And that means anytime you want to move forward with this instrument, you fight industry, you fight the oil industry, you fight the major emitters like refiners, you fight all of the manufacturers, you fight the food processors, you fight them all at the same time, rather than thinking about step-by-step opportunities to regulate, subsidize, do public expenditures, set performance standards. You can go step by step with those alternate approaches. And that we think is a big part of the reason you have such different levels of ambition in places like California. The story for the European Union is somewhat different, and we wanted to call out the experience with the EU because the EU has been a major success story in our view, and it's something we talk a lot about in the book. We also think it's an exception, and that the conditions you see in Europe are unlikely to be found in very many other places. Europe very famously these days has prices that are almost at $50 a ton these days. This is a couple of months out of date, these data. Remarkable high prices right now that are pushing Europe's electricity sector to clean up its act, including with member states that have historically favored coal. So this is a big deal in the electricity sector, and it's a really good outcome as far as we're concerned. But it also follows nearly a decade of prices being stuck in extremely low gear, as Europe first began importing over 1 billion questionable offset credits from international offsetting and burden sharing agreements under the Kyoto Protocol era, as well as suffering the consequences of a massive oversupply problem that it's related in part to the policies of its member states, which like California push on other measures, and the effects of the Great Recession from last decade. It took extraordinary efforts to improve the capacity of European regulators to centralize political authority and ultimately set up major reforms that began a couple of years ago that pulled all of this together. And the Europeans have demonstrated how to do that in a very effective way that we think other markets should copy and consider. But there are a couple of problems that Europe hasn't solved that everyone needs to be paying attention to, because for all of the success of this case study, and it is a very big success, we have a couple of major problems. The first major problem Europe is living through right now, which is that this program applies to its industrial sector. And that means all of the trade exposed industries, particularly those operating in international commodity markets, are facing major competitiveness concerns. And the standard textbook answer that analysts today give is, well, let's just do border carbon adjustments. Let's come up with trade measures that equilibrate the price of carbon at the border, rebate the exporters, charge the importers, and now we have this even playing field through this beautifully designed concept. The problem with border carbon adjustments, beyond the fact that they're wickedly difficult to do in practice, is that the politics don't necessarily cut in that direction. It was assumed that when Europe was pushing very, very hard on these measures, that it would increase the possibility of a club of climate-oriented countries to come together to advocate for border carbon adjustments. What we're seeing instead right now is the United States, which has talked about these kinds of issues in the past, is also signaling maybe there's cold feet in the US, because Europe's border carbon measures would absolutely be applied to and potentially target US imports. And if you think the United States reaction to border carbon adjustments is tense or complicated, I promise you the Indian and Chinese trade perspectives are even more significant and challenging as far as border adjustments are concerned. If you can do a border carbon adjustment, you can address this problem, but the politics we think are much more complex than many analysts suppose. The second issue that is essentially unresolved in these political systems is the question of transportation fuel price impacts, which are the most politically salient for the everyday voter. And the standard response to this, which I think is absolutely good economic policy, but which we believe may be much more politically tenuous than many people want to admit, is the use of a significant, dominant, possibly even universal share of the revenues collected by these programs going back to households in the form of flat per capita rebates or other forms of progressive income transfers. Now, the fact is, when you transfer on incomes like this, you end up making the lowest income households better off. So there is a net progressive effect of a tax on carbon or a price on carbon combined with these rebates, but it's a very difficult political proposition. I've put up here two groups: the Citizens Climate Lobby, a grassroots political organization in the United States that advocates for these policies, and an industry-backed group called the Climate Leadership Council, which does the same. The major difference between them is the third rail we need to talk about in the United States, which is that most of the industrial proposals, those backed particularly by the oil industry, also come with significant regulatory rollbacks. And the prospect of trying to roll back regulations that are favored by many stakeholders at the same time you're sort of betting the farm on border adjustments and dividends, we think that's a very unstable design, even though it's one that on paper I personally support. I've even worked on legislation to do this in the past at both the state and the federal level. People don't like it, and we need to talk about that. The last thing I want to say before we wrap up is the problem of how most markets have responded when they've been unable to successfully tackle the problems I just discussed. And that is a heavy reliance on mechanisms that displace the burden of action somewhere else. So carbon offsets are the primary mechanism by which this is done. The theory, perfectly sound from a climate perspective. If it's cheaper for somebody else to cut their emissions somewhere else or to remove carbon somewhere else, let them do that, pay them for it, take the credit, and impose lower costs on your domestic interests. The problem is that in every single compliance program, the demand for these offsets comes from the incumbent industries who, to be perfectly honest, don't care about the quality of the offsets. They want high volumes of low prices because they're trying to get that simple compliance pathway. A lot of the NGOs you would hope would be standing up to monitor quality in these programs actually have a kind of perverse interest to capture the revenue stream that comes as private entities effectively buy their way out of the compliance option and often direct the money and the investment to preferred outcomes in, say, forest conservation. Very famously, the Kyoto era offsets programs invested heavily in very questionable offsets with industrial gases and clean electricity. More recently in the United States and in the voluntary markets that are scaling up in a world of net zero corporate pledges, you're seeing some very suspicious claims being made on forest carbon and increasingly on soil carbon. And we have a theory that we think explains why in compliance markets it's such a disastrous experience you want to move away from it as fast as possible. So the last thing I want to say here is our theory of politics, we hope, allows us to explain four really important things. One, Why do you get low prices and these Potemkin market outcomes? 2, why multi-sector programs, although attractive with sort of economic theory, become major political liabilities for people who have to hold together political coalitions. 3rd, why the European example works. They've instituted major reforms, they cut off their offsets, and they've driven prices up to the point where it's making a big difference in electricity, but presenting a major challenge for industry. And 4th, why offsets have become essentially a nightmare for everybody who's used them. And when we see people emerge from Potemkin market outcomes, it's usually because they cut back on offsets. The last thing I want to say before handing the mic back to David is we also have some thoughts in the book about how to make markets work better. The first recommendation follows from this concept of veto points. The smaller the coverage of the program, the easier the ability to push the political stakeholders farther. You'd rather have multiple programs, we think, than a single program that tries to put all these politics in a single game. Second recommendation is the more you can make markets like taxes, the easier it is to essentially organize the politics around the beneficiaries on the revenue side and to make sure those who are experiencing political pain know what the upper limit on that pain is. And the European experience and the East Coast RGGI program both give really great lessons on how to do this from a technical perspective. And we think everybody, including places like California, need to think very carefully about those kinds of approaches. Third thing to say is that offsets really aren't working. They haven't worked. We don't think they ever will work. You can replace them with the price controls you want by limiting prices. You can direct the spending in the direction you want by directing the spending through competitive public programs. And you don't have to assume perfection with these vastly complicated programs that are almost impossible to monitor. Fourth and final thing to say, we talk a bit in the book about market links. People have fetishized market links, we think. Market links are perfectly good when you figured out how to run a system the way you want it. And when you create Potemkin systems and start linking them together, you put everybody into that low gear system and make it very difficult to reform. So with that, let me turn it over to David to close it out. And I'm very much looking forward to Joe and Suzi's thoughts.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Danny. And I just want to say one thing at the very end here, which is one can make markets perform better in a way that's much more attentive to the political economy. And that's the argument that Danny just summarized, that we have a whole chapter about that in the book. Part of that is also, frankly, doing a better job with the way the money that's raised in these markets gets spent. There's a tendency to set that aside and really focus on the effect of the prices on the behavior of firms. But if you think prices are going to be lower than what society is really willing to pay, then the price effect is not unimportant, but it's also what you do with the revenues that get raised. And all this points us in the direction of what might be called industrial policy. There's a key word here missing on the slide, not just carbon prices, not just market instruments, but complementary approaches where, frankly, the industrial policy does more of the heavy lifting. Not because that's necessarily plan A, if you think about this optimally, but because it's plan feasible when you think about this politically. We have a lot of ideas in the book about how to make industrial policy more effective, how the government can intervene in economies in ways that are less distortionary, more effective in pushing boundaries. And we may want to talk some about that today, but I think the bulk of the debate today is about what's really happening with carbon pricing. And we've laid out an argument why, when you think about this politically, you should be a little more suspicious. So thank you very much, and look forward to the discussions with Joe and Suzi.
Thank you very much, David and Danny. That was a very interesting presentation. Now we have commentary and response by Suzi Kerr and Joseph Majkut. So Suzi Kerr is the chief economist at Environmental Defense Fund. She graduated from Harvard University in 1995 with a PhD in economics. In 2018, she was president of the Australasian Agricultural and Resource Economic Society. Her research work focuses on domestic and international climate change mitigation policy, with special emphasis on emissions pricing and land-related emissions and sequestration. Joseph Majkut is director of climate policy at the Niskanen Center. He is an expert in climate science, climate policy, and risk and uncertainty. He holds a PhD from Princeton University in atmospheric and oceanic sciences. So I think Suzi is going to start, and then Joe is going to follow.
Good afternoon. I think you've got the order reversed. Okay. I'm going to lead off, and then hopefully I can get us on first base and Suzi can knock me home. Thank you to our speakers. I really enjoyed this book. While I play Mr. Necessary and Sufficient, on the internet. I think that the criticisms that you've raised and the empirical reality for how well we've been able to institute carbon pricing in the United States really has to be dealt with, not just in the United States, excuse me, around the world. We need to confront the challenges that we've found. Many people have found them through decades of hard work advocating for these policies or trying to design them, and think carefully about how to make them better. So I look forward to a productive discussion. I'm now going to switch to my slides and offer a few thoughts on the book and what we might be able to learn from it as advocates. By way of introduction, the Niskanen Center is a 501c3 organization located in Washington, D.C., and we advocate for a carbon price as the principal means of reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. I think it's important to remind ourselves of the basic case for why a carbon price as a policy intent on bringing us to net zero is an important one to make work well, and why I think we should favor it as implementing one early as opposed to late. Principally, the case here is efficiency. We need to reduce emissions quickly, and we know that that's not necessarily going to be a cost-free process. In particular, Jesse and his colleagues at Princeton estimate that the energy cost increase associated above reference with a net zero economy is 1 to 3% of GDP. Those are very large numbers. This is going to take large investments. And so the more we can do it, we can create policies that will be efficient, that will work well, the more we're going to realize public benefits. And I think there's a real tension between the sort of political economy arguments that are being made and hold some water by David and Danny, and the need for public policy to achieve the best public benefit that it can. I'm particularly interested in the two principal things that carbon pricing drives, both conservation and innovation. We know that higher prices encourage conservation. And I think one of the things that we can pin for later is a discussion around what's their role in driving innovation. I have no fundamental opposition to industrial policy, but one of the cases for carbon pricing is that prices are an important part of creating economic opportunity. Relative prices are an important part of creating economic opportunity for the innovators of a low carbon economy. I also will admit, however, that the industrial policy is probably something we should think more carefully about, and it can be really important to the politics of transition. In our work at the federal policy level, we've seen particularly Republicans historically hesitant to embrace climate action, have embraced clean energy as it gets bigger in their states. That story is pretty straightforward to tell. The picture that we see here shows us results from a study from Columbia University and others that was released last year that I think is helpful in setting the tone. If we want to have a net zero economy, what is the carbon price we would need to reduce emissions, to capture conservation emissions or emissions reductions, and induce innovation for the long term? It's a model-based study, but they find that the prices we need are somewhere in the range of $50 to $100 per ton over the next decade. And I think those are actually the prices that we can talk about realistically, not from the past decade and a half, but for the one going forward. The black bars here show you those carbon prices that have been introduced in Congress. Whether we could get those bills to pass is a question, but we are talking about what I think are net zero appropriate targets here. Ooh, how do I move my slide forward? There we go. I also think that as intentions for climate change get more serious, we will see more serious prices. As Danny mentions, the European Union has been making reforms and changed its goals for emissions reductions leading up to 2030. Price forecasts have gone up. Likewise, we've seen in Canada the embrace of a fairly ambitious increase in their federal carbon pricing program. And that one, revenue is primarily slated for rebates back to the population. And I would expect, if that policy holds, that by the end of the decade, it's just a normal part of the Canadian tax system, and most households are being made whole. Next slide. one of the keys in the book that I think we need to spend a little bit of time on is thinking about carbon prices or carbon markets as things that can work in the national interest. That this sort of top-down picture of setting global goals and then designing marketplaces early that can help us accomplish those global goals has struggled to be realized in real politics. And so when we're thinking about how do we design things for the national interest, and particularly in Niskanen, how do we design a carbon taxation system that can be sold in the national interest and then exported abroad, we find that the carbon tax has two key elements that I think are underdeveloped in the discussion so far today. One is raising a carbon tax does create opportunities to achieve partisan priorities in the United States. The US spends a lot of money compared to what it brings in terms of revenue. And that is a precondition. That was a condition before we had COVID relief spending. So, and over the next decade, we expect taxes to go up both on investment and income. The way I would think about this right now is, with a Democratic Senate and House and presidency, the talk about budget reconciliation in the House or in Congress, there is real political opportunity to create carbon pricing and achieve ends that Democrats might want to seek, whether that's infrastructure spending or other sort of distributional programs, child tax credits, poverty relief, et cetera. We also know that border adjustments, while difficult to perhaps set up and administer, would, if they were done correctly, create competitive advantage for some domestic industries in the United States. US steel is cleaner than our competitors. This graphic here shows us emissions intensity of European imported steel. And it was created by the Boston Consulting Group as they were thinking through the business connotations, the market connotations of the EU levying a border fee on its own imports. And you see down in the lower left there, US carbon intensity of steel is much lower. And I think more markets that would be carbon aware would help us, would help certain industries in the United States. There's also a disadvantage for Russian oil and gas production that we probably shouldn't leave on the table. And lastly, on the regulation bit, moving quickly to respecting my time, administrative procedure in the United States is clunky and slow. The book argues that we're better now. The regulations that we have now, the regulatory states we have now are better than those of the 60s and 70s. They learn, they're adaptable, but that process is very, very slow. And if we think about trying to achieve climate targets over the next decade or the next 2 decades, I think we can look at the Obama Clean Power Plan, which was agreed to, the EPA agreed to rulemaking in 2010, proposed a rule in 2014, finalized it in 2015, lost in the Supreme Court in 2016, changes in administrations, delayed action for another 4 years. And if you look at a serious alternative to a federal carbon tax, something like the Clean Future Act, which was just introduced in the House of Representatives, it requires at least 22 agency rulemakings within the first 2 years of enactment that are not quite as large as something like the Clean Power Plan, but would be onerous. And relying on a industrial policy and a regulation approach, which is kind of what we have today, leaves there huge opportunities for state, industry, and administrative delays. With that, I close. I thank our authors, and I look forward to Suzi's comments. I will run your slides.
Thank you, Danny. So kia ora tātou, and thank you, Jesse, Bob, and others for inviting me to participate today. I also read the book again, and I ferociously agree with much of the material in the book, the need for long-term vision about where we're going, for experimentation, and for strategic leadership that inspires and supports the followers. Changing climate change is like shifting a complex dynamic system into a new equilibrium. That's a really daunting task, and it's not something we're going to achieve simply with linear thinking. We need to plan, and the Net Zero America work is a nice example of that. We need to motivate people. We need to reassure people about the changes, and we need to build trust that we can work together on this. I worry about some of the messages that could be taken out of the book, particularly about carbon pricing and the way carbon pricing can play a role within the effort. we've seen a lot of simplistic stories over the years about which policy instrument is best. And those simplistic stories, particularly when applied in a generic way, can be very dangerous. We've seen the tax versus ETS debate, which has not been a useful one for moving policy forward. We need a portfolio of policies and actions, and we should be arguing yes and lots of good policies. There will be some overlap, there will be some mistakes, but we need to be, given the urgency of the problem, we need to be dealing with a wide range of possibilities. And every country is different. Every country is different in the sort of policies they will need because their economies are different, their capability is different, and their politics is different. So things that won't work politically in the United States may work very well in some other countries. It's very easy to criticize, and economists are particularly good at this. We have endless papers that show how particular regulatory interventions are ineffective. They lead to rebound. They're not having the effects that are anticipated. It's really hard to create effective policy. So we do have some evidence, some significant evidence that prices can be effective. And by effective, I don't mean they solve the whole problem, but that they do help and they make change in the right directions. We probably have less evidence of that on industrial policy. And by that, I don't mean that we shouldn't do industrial policy and work hard on it, but we shouldn't rely on it. Industrial policies are also enormously subject to political pressures that can make them less effective. And in many countries, the administrative capability to implement those will also be terrifically challenging. Next slide, please. So cap and trade can play a really critical role. And there are two particular ways that I think are important here. One is that there are no other policies in our toolbox that can apply an enforceable limit across a wide set of sources. And the New Zealand case shows that that can be up to nearly 100% of emissions in a country. So why does it matter that we are able to put on an enforceable limit? The first one is that it allows us to create a backstop for other policies. And this is the way I think it has been used in California. It makes sure that the package as a whole actually does add up to the goals if the emissions trading system cap is set in a way that is consistent with those goals. And it addresses problems like rebound or over-optimism about the likely effects of policies and policy interactions. It also is really valuable in facilitating credible international commitments. If you have a solid, well-designed emissions trading system that covers a large part of your economy, and then you make a commitment in a United Nations agreement, then as long as you translate that through to your emissions trading system, your cap and trade, by an adjustment of the caps over time, people can see that you actually have the ability to comply with that and that you've made a visible legal commitment to do so. It's also potentially a very valuable tool for facilitating international transfers that have high integrity. I agree with David and Danny that offsets have real problems. They have right from the very beginning, and I've never been a fan. But we do need situations, we do need the ability to reward some activities that are not easily included in regulation or in standard pricing systems. And most importantly, we do need the ability to transfer resources and help and investment to developing countries who are just not going to go fast enough, even if they take on 2050 or 2060 net zero commitments. We need them to be able to move faster. And if they have credible, enforceable limits on their emissions, that can be the basis for high integrity transfers. Also, we know that price signals really matter, and they matter partly, or very heavily, as investment signals. The most important thing out of an emissions trading system is not the effect on current behavior, but the effect on investment. They are a signal, one among many signals to investors of how serious society actually is about addressing this problem. So that's a useful role to have. And in reverse, the price and emissions trading system tells us what investors think about the likely future intensity of that regulation, because it's telling them how much they're willing to invest in buying allowances and banking them for the future. Also, we've tended to present emissions pricing as though it's providing an incentive for people to do something they didn't want to do. But I think that it's really shifted a lot in the last 5 or 10 years. There's a lot of companies now who are showing that they are willing to act, but the prices and the economic environment can fight against them because it puts acting and incurring costs, puts them at a competitive disadvantage. So including carbon pricing will enable those companies to do the mitigation that they are willing to do without loss of profit. It also critically supports mitigation by all actors. And we tend to focus on some of the largest actors in the economy. That makes a lot of sense in many ways. But there's a large number of actors that are small, but cumulatively add up to really a large group. So next slide, please. The emissions trading system that I've been most involved with is the New Zealand emissions trading system. And because New Zealand is so small, the only real impact that our policies have on global climate change is through exactly the sort of experimentation and enabling and inspiring that Dave and Danny call inspiring followership. So New Zealand is a country also where complex policy is difficult to implement. It's not that we're not capable, but there are very few of us. So our experimentation has largely focused on emissions trading, which is actually a relatively simple policy to implement relative to industrial policy, which we did actually try previously. Our experience in New Zealand really reinforces the message that good policy takes time. It's not something that you can create and then evaluate a few years later and say whether it's working or not. It is going to evolve. You're going to have to iterate and improve it over time. When we don't have time, that's hard to accept. But we are doing better at managing these systems over time, and we've learned a lot. So we're creating stable institutions. New Zealand has a climate commission. The EU has much better institutions managing its carbon pricing. And as those institutions get stronger, the prices are getting higher. We're getting better at managing prices and quantities within those systems. And that's largely, in my mind, nullifying the debate between carbon taxes and carbon pricing. And we're beginning to seriously reassess the high levels of free allocation. I would say New Zealand has very low levels of free allocation, but most countries do have high levels. And we're refocusing on how we can use that revenue. Next slide, please. So please don't make bets with our future. We need to invest in a portfolio. We need to be working on a wide range of fronts, a wide range of different sorts of instruments. And we do need instruments that will keep us honest. And that's where an enforceable limit can be terrifically helpful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, both sets of panelists, for a very interesting beginning to our conversation. I'm going to ask one question and then turn to questions from the audience. And the question is this: there are 2 points of agreement between the 2 teams here. You agree that carbon prices can be good policy, very efficient. And if you can get a carbon policy, if a divinity could impose a carbon policy on us, we'd probably all 4 agree that it should be done. You also agree that carbon policies, as David and Danny have shown in the last decade, have been way too low to accomplish very much. What I want to ask David and Danny first, and then Joe and Suzi, is what political processes can be realistically imagined during the next decade that could generate a sufficiently high carbon price, let us say $1,500 a ton, that would make a genuine difference, as the EU has started to move toward. So David, do you want to start?
Yeah, maybe I'll start there. And I think you've summarized the areas of agreement. We have disagreement about how big the portfolio is in different areas and so on. We have violent agreement about the theory of using markets. The place to look where you can really do the most with carbon pricing is in the sectors where you can manage the consequential politics of that most readily. And so we see that in the power sector. So you could make quite a lot of progress, and indeed that is the European experience now, make quite a lot of progress bringing up prices in the power sector, managing through tariff control and so on the consequences of that. It's literally bolted to the ground. So it's not going to be migrating to another country to escape regulation, and not going to be competing. We're not competing with electric generators in Russia. And so that's the place that, in some sense, I think that's going to be the high water mark.
Suzi or Joe?
So I'll just throw in a couple of thoughts. And one is building bipartisan institutions. And I know this is terrifically difficult in the US, but I think it's something that other countries have managed to achieve and can manage to achieve, and depoliticizing that carbon price so that it becomes a financial issue. It becomes something that's about the Treasury and not about the ministries for environment, etc. I think can be very helpful. And I think our experience has certainly shown that. I think the other thing is, as David and Danny's policies are successful in building up new sectors, or if you include sectors that are inevitably on the winning side of prices, you're going to be building those constituencies for high prices. And in New Zealand, it's been really critical that we include forestry, not as really offsets, but as an integral part of the emissions trading system. And foresters win out of the system. So they have been a critical lobby group for getting higher prices and better price control.
Okay, let me pick up on the bipartisan point. There are a couple of questions from the attendees, which focus on either on two questions, both of which have to do with bipartisanship. One is industry, including big oil firms, has to some extent supported a carbon tax, as David, or I think it was David said, provided that there be some sort of regulatory rollback. And I want to know, I think our attendees want to know whether this is a feint or whether it's genuine support. Would they actually form a basis for a coalition with a realistic compromise, or would they say, oh no, sorry, you didn't roll back all those regulations we don't like, and therefore we're not supporting it? And this relates to a question by an attendee who's anonymous, asking how you would assess the prospect for fee and dividend programs like the Citizens Climate Lobby Bill, closely related. Would the direct cash payments change the politics, or would that be turned on its head once it was a serious proposal? So can I start with David or Danny again, and then I'll come to Joe or Suzi.
Sure. So, I mean, I think the question of regulatory rollbacks is one of the toughest, and it's something that I can't sit here and say what the American Petroleum Institute's actually going to demand as part of these negotiations. But I think there's a pretty long history of there being some questions around both the sincerity of those efforts and the scope of what's desired as a compromise. And I'll point to you, there's no greater example of this than in California, where the oil industry demanded massive regulatory rollbacks that took away the climate regulators' ability to set direct regulations on either our refining industry or our upstream oil and gas industry, period, end. Lost all regulatory authority on that industry. Hopefully we're going to get that back. But that was a precondition of the extension of the cap and trade program to isolate a price that did very little to affect those sectors. And I think the national industry is probably thinking on similar strategic terms. If we got to a real negotiation around this, I think this question of what the rollback would be has got to be front and center in the conversation. And half promises and illusions and vague statements make me very concerned about the direction that conversation would head in. But I can't tell you it's resolved because nobody's saying anything concrete that has real political muscle right now. Second thing I want to say, just to touch briefly on the Citizens Climate Lobby point, the problem that we're trying to address is transportation fuel prices are visible and toxic. And a dividend is a solution to that on paper. I love it. I think it's a great policy. I even helped write a bill in California to do just that. The problem is there isn't much of a serious constituency for that beyond the educated activist community. And when you start to get into real conversations around billions of dollars, lots of other hands come into that pie and start taking away from it. If you could get it, I think it could potentially help address these concerns. But we need to watch right now that conversation unfolding in Saskatchewan and Alberta up in Canada, where the federal government has said, this is what we're going to do. And if you believe that this theory is going to address the political problem I've identified, Watch how conservative parts of Canada react to those ideas. So far, it's not looking particularly good, even though I will tell you as an economist, you pencil the numbers out, it is absolutely a progressive policy. It's not clear to me that that resolves the political problem that it's designed to solve.
So let me ask a follow-up before coming to Suzi and Joe about cap and dividend. We know from behavioral economics that people discount the future tremendously. We also know from political science that Americans don't trust the government. So a cap and dividend policy that says, here, we're going to tax you now, and we promise to give you money back in a year, is going to be highly discounted, both for time reasons and because of distrust. What if we designed a cap and dividend program where the people got the money first? We borrow money all the time. Why not send people checks in October and then start the tax? And then the next October, pay them out of the tax. You just borrow money for 1 year, and they'd always be ahead of the game. I'm going to ask Joe or Suzi to comment now in general and also on that suggestion.
Well, I think there have been proposals to sort of front load any sort of carbon dividend before the tax sets in, or sort of average it over the first few years, so that as the tax ramp or the price signal ramps up, there's a sort of visible benefit. I think those are kind of tweaking around the edges. I think it's, the thing that I've learned in the past year is that cash benefits in the American political system are relatively popular. There are a lot of people walking around Washington, D.C. who think they have jobs and congressional majorities because of direct cash transfers to voters. Those can't be done forever out of deficit spending. And so it may be that one of the things electeds learn over this year is that a transfer system that is more direct, more immediate, and more visible can buy support for policies long-term. The logic is relatively similar. We had to close down large parts of society and people are struggling. And so to protect public good, and therefore we're gonna distribute money to help people out. In the same way, we have to raise prices on carbon because climate change is going to be really, really bad. And because we're doing that, we're going to distribute money. I don't know. Right? It's a proposal that's been around a long time. If it was magical, it would have worked by now. But I do think we could be at an inflection point for that style of policy thinking. On the question of regulations and industry support, I do think we have to take seriously the moves that have happened over the last 6 months. Business Roundtable in the United States exclusively, the Business Roundtable, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, maybe API to some, the American Petroleum Institute, have all started talking about economy-wide market-based measures. I think that is probably more genuine than the average onlooker would think. And I think that the negotiations around what is the cost of entry, regulatory reform, regulatory specification are fairly wide open. The Niskanen Center has been through those in several instances before, identifying policy options, what can win support. Do you write greenhouse gases out of the Clean Air Act altogether? I don't think that's going to be the solution. But do you find those places where the price is going to work better and you have confidence for that, and relieve industry and the administrations, the agencies, from having to regulate in those fields and allow them to concentrate in other places? I think that's actually a potentially productive conversation.
Thank you very much. Now, we've been talking about U.S. policy, and one of our questions from Kevin Leahy asks about the international context. He asked, does the viability of a carbon price or cap and trade in other countries depend at all on U.S. willingness to take on similar policy? A carbon price while your competitors are sitting on sidelines makes a strong case for competitive disadvantage for politicians. Could it be argued that the U.S. has become the primary drag on carbon pricing in other places, causing them to dial back carbon price ambition? David, do you want to take up this one?
Yeah, well, so it's a good question. I think so far we don't see a lot of evidence that the U.S. has been the primary drag. And other countries have gone and done this, knowing that the U.S. is, shall we say, modestly flaky in its climate policy. New Zealand's done this. Korea's got a program. The Europeans in particular have done this. To me, what's interesting about the question in particular is what the future looks like, precisely because we're now at that point where the sectors that are included in the policy, in these market policies that are trade exposed, are now looking around at their competitors in the world. And they either need trade relief with some kind of direct measure, government procurement or some kind of compensation, or they need border adjustments. And I think that is where we are. And we've also seen that it's easy to talk about border adjustments when you're running for office, and then when you're in power and your climate emissaries overseas, and you look at the consequences of Europe in particular doing border adjustments for U.S. industry, that's kind of horrifying. I will just add one footnote about that. In the real world, border adjustments is going to be a lot harder than I think people think. You can imagine theoretically how to do this and stay compliant with the WTO strictures, insofar as compliance with the WTO, that quaint notion, is still relevant these days. But in the real world, if you've got policy instruments that are market instruments, and then mostly all kinds of other regulatory, like a dog's breakfast of regulatory stuff going on as well, and they're interacting with each other, then you've got to figure out how to do what in the trade world was called tarification. Turn all that stuff into tariff equivalents and then adjust them, and then frankly adjust them further because you've got different suppliers with different carbon intensity. And it very quickly becomes a swamp, not one that's impossible to solve for some industries in very concentrated ways, but it's going to be a whole lot harder. And so I think that's the world we're in. And in that world, I think the concerns that Kevin Lay has raised, those concerns are going to become more apparent.
Let me add, as a student of international politics, it's also a matter of power. Without an overwhelming coalition, which would have to include China, this means a trade war, and you won't be able to maintain it. If you have an 85% support for a certain level, which would probably not be very high, of carbon tax, then you can probably coerce everybody else into going along. But if you have 50 or 60%, you have a trade war. And that is not going to be easy. So I think there's lots to be said for this policy, but it really will take a fair amount of work. Now, Helene Benveniste of Princeton has a question, which I'm interpreting following Jesse as follows. How do you calculate the implicit carbon price of non-carbon pricing policies like subsidies or renewable portfolio standards? When you all say confidently, well, this RPS is like an $85 carbon price, how do you do that? How do you get that number?
So, I mean, that's you do basic economics where you have to estimate the emissions outcomes you think you get from the program, and then you calculate the cost premium essentially of that program. Those are both estimates. Once you have that volume and that dollar amount, you can do a dollar per ton equivalence, but it is very much a calculation. It's an indirect measure. So the number I cited about the RPS came from our legislative analyst's office, which is the state equivalent of the CBO. It's about the best sort of neutral number you could get, but like all of these numbers, they're implicit and calculated rather than observed directly. And again, just to tie this back in, David and I are 100% on board. Transparency and clarity of explicit market prices, that's a benefit to analysts. That's, we're arguing, a toxicity to real politics. But that is how you do it, and the criticism that one might do that poorly or not have the correct answer is a totally appropriate criticism.
Okay, we have a couple of questions from Gabriel Weil and Tony Cerna, which are similar. And I think this is, Danny, these are mostly for you. And the question, that as Tony puts it, is, if transportation is so price sensitive, why is the California fuel price higher than the economy-wide price? Doesn't the oil industry fight that as hard as it fights cap and trade? What's going on here when you have a higher transportation price?
So yes, I would say they do fight it. It's probably, they hate it probably most of all things that they're subject to in California. And the reason it's more politically sustainable than an actual explicit cap and trade price is because of the way it's the technical design of the program. And just as a quick aside here, I actually think it's industrial policy. I think a single sector trading program is basically flexible regulations, can be industrial policy that's technology forcing. This is, I think, a prime example of a policy you could put almost any label on. The way it works is that the price signal is applied just to the difference between the carbon intensity of the gallon of fuel that's being sold and the target intensity. So that marginal $200 price signal only applies to a fraction of the emissions effectively. So only a fraction of that price signal is passed on to consumers, but the producer sees the marginal cost, which is why you see direct air capture companies saying $200 a ton, I'm looking over there. And it's why the price impact, while the targets are not yet as ambitious as they're going to be in the future, produces a relatively modest consumer price impact relative to that sticker. If you did $200 a ton through cap and trade, you'd be looking at something like $1.80 in terms of the dollar per gallon impacts, which no politician would ever stand up and say, I'd like to do that. You don't see that full price signal because of the design of that policy, and that is entirely consistent with our theory about how you address the political needs of these different stakeholders and actors, and it helps explain why that single sector policy has persisted and been technology forcing. I have plenty of critical things to say about it, but those fundamentals help explain how you get that marginal price signal.
So is this a fundamental difference between the economist's way of looking at it and the political scientist's way of looking at it? You political scientists are saying we ought to differentiate these policies. Don't worry about them being consistent. Some can be higher prices, some lower prices. Look for the political opportunities. Let the political market bear what it can bear. The economists tend to say, I think, and I'll ask Suzi about this, I mean, much more efficient if you have an economy-wide price. We can show you in a whole year of economics courses why it's a bad idea to have differential prices. You're building in inefficiencies. You're paying more than you have to pay for a given ton of emissions. How do we reconcile those different disciplinary orientations? And I'll let Suzi respond, because Danny and David have been quite explicit about their desire to differentiate sectors and differentiate policies.
Yeah, so Bob, you've totally nailed it. Not surprisingly, that it is less efficient if you've got different prices across different activities and different sectors, and that creates inefficiency. It makes it more costly for us to achieve ambition, and it means that, you know, for a given level of willingness to put in effort, we're going to achieve less mitigation. But I think a way of reconciling it is that when we do economics, you think about how to get efficiency subject to the constraints you face. And in different places, you're going to face different political constraints. And if you thought about those as constraints on policy design, you'd be in a second best policy design world, and possibly the sort of thing that David and Danny are talking about is actually the best policy that is feasible. And so you could formalize that if you wanted to. Of course, that politics is different in every place. And in New Zealand, for example, and I've seen this also in Colombia, where we're doing a lot of work, actually going broad makes it easier to get carbon prices through, because the sectors don't like to think that their sector is being unduly pressured relative to others. So it is a specific thing to particular locations.
And can I just say something just as an addendum to that, Bob? You said you political scientists.
Well, I'm a political scientist, but I'm trying to be objective here.
Don't run from the stage just yet. I think we political scientists ignore cost to our peril. We have to have a strategy that is politically sensitive and also, frankly, attentive to the marketing. Billy Pizer's friendly amendment that we should be careful what we call industrial policy, where that term is toxic. We should be careful what we call the Green New Deal, where that term is toxic. So all that stuff matters a lot in how one thinks about the politics here. But part of what we're trying to do in the book is also lay out a vision for how, let's call it industrial policy for a moment, how that gets done in a way that's attentive to the quality of institutions, cost effectiveness, economic efficiency. Because if we have a policy that's just all politics and it's just whatever goes, then that's a policy that probably is going to have a hard time scaling, and also, frankly, have it be a policy that has a hard time being actually dynamic in bringing in new supporters and making whole new sections of the economy that are much cleaner. And so that, I think it's important that we not swing all the way the opposite direction, and just as long as it's politically feasible, then we're all in. That would be a reckless strategy.
This gets us to the question, what you referred to pork before. If we think about pork as popular payments from government to politically powerful groups, we could think about the $1,400 payments of this week as pork, as well as slipping in certain benefits to industries and industrial policy. Right? They're both forms of pork. Gordon Gekko famously said, "Greed is good." Is pork good, or under what conditions? I'll ask Joe first. Is under what conditions is pork good, and on what conditions is it bad?
Well, in this context, I think we should think about pork as when it's being productively spent in a way that reduces marginal abatement curves so that we can move more and more elements or pieces of this problem into the sort of, let's call it the market floor, right? If we're going to use the California example. There are places where pork has gone terrifically wrong. The renewable fuel standard is not a shining example of successful industrial policy, but a lot of people benefit from it, and it's politically important because of that. But there are cases where we are seeing high carbon prices over narrow sectors of the economy drive, as Danny says, real technological change, and we should learn from those examples. So I think as long as we're finding places where productivity is increasing or we're witnessing innovation, which allows, you're creating micro markets, you're allowing for competition, you're allowing for new entrants. We should be focusing in those places, and we should be on guard for when the pork gets too fatty, if that's a reasonable analogy.
Look, just to add to this, I think this is really important because, to go back to your earlier question, my message to economists when I talk particularly to grad students is we live in a second or third or fourth best world. Start thinking there, which is what all of my best economist friends are doing when we're actually in these kinds of negotiations anyway. I want to move the conversation there because we need the econ insights. The problem with the pork issue is that there's always going to be some pork that is essential to holding systems together. I'm not here to say what that should be. I'm not expressing a normative judgment, but we do need to study that, and we do need to have grounded empirical arguments about what works and what doesn't. I think we've ignored this on the spending side of these programs, and in the book we talk a lot about how to maybe fix and think about some of that. But the idea that there are going to be people who do the wrong thing with pork, and that you're going to need some pork to hold together coalitions, I think that's sound fundamental political science. We need to start articulating not my preference is this, your preference is that, but having really solid numbers on this, which is why I want my friends in the economics community to study the just raw, ugly details of the world first and foremost, rather than start with the theory and say, how far away from ideal are we? That to me is not a very interesting question. The question of what gains and losses you get with different combinations of coalitions and standards and spending. That's, I think, where all the action is. And I'm so interested in watching the younger generation confront those issues directly, because I think we're going to learn a lot and use that as a basis to make reforms over time.
Great. Jesse Jenkins says on the chat to the panelists that the second best is just the real world. And I think we probably agree. Cynthia Burbank has a couple of questions, which I'm going to combine into one. They're both focused on the equality or inequality effects of various climate policies. So she says, have Danny and Victor Danny and David looked at the income economic effects of real world regulations on lower and middle income households? And she also asked, have they looked at whether the California cap and trade program is regressive in its effect on households? So Danny and David, one of you want to respond to that?
I'll just say, I think that's an important set of questions. Equity issues have got to be front and center in these issues. We can't hide the ball. David's comments about going too far in the extreme of cost and effectiveness being unacceptable, perfectly good. But to reframe this slightly, carbon pricing and aggressive regulations both potentially have regressive impacts. The carbon pricing community that's advocated for dividends says by combining a rebate with an initially regressive incidence, we create a progressive outcome. I agree. If you combine it with progressive income taxes, progressive capital taxes, rather than energy taxes as the primary means, you actually get an even more progressive outcome. And I think one of the problems, I don't think we resolve in the book, but when you talk about the difference between a country like the United States or an area like Europe, where there's a much different social safety net, different services, different taxation levels, you have very different fundamental needs for driving equity and the marginal impact of your energy and climate policies than you might here, where we frankly don't have any of that stuff. But you do start, as you think about the scale of this problem, the scale of the transfers, you do start to need to think more about the overall equity impacts, which is not just a question of one policy versus another, but the overall social safety net we deal with on a regular basis. And I think that's probably where Joe finds an interest in thinking about carbon taxation as a way to support some of those ongoing transfers. But to me, I don't think you can disconnect those issues with the point that non-market policies have potentially higher impacts, need to be studied and understood. I'm on board. We got to study and understand that. But we also can't pretend away the fact that you're not going to impose $200 a ton directly on a gas tax. It's not going to happen.
Okay, Joe, do you want to comment, or Suzi, you want to comment?
Yeah, two just brief points. The distributive nature of the tax code in any particular place is what Congress kind of decides it needs to be. I think that, narrowly focusing the connection between some sort of rebate structure, some sort of tax cut, and what then the money to carbon tax raises is, there is a political argument there that I don't think we should set aside, because it's working in places that don't look that different from the U.S. I also think it's important when we think about developing countries, as economies develop, is carbon a thing that can help support the growth of infrastructure or the growth of general government services, right? This is not just a developing country question or developed country question. Lastly, I think I think the regressivity of the alternative mechanisms is something that should be studied. I also think that the cost imposition in terms of its effect on our ability to decarbonize is also important, right? I know Danny and David have studied the California model very carefully, but it is a place where electricity prices, it's not a low-cost state, and it's a place where electricity prices are going up, and we're already seeing concerns that that's going to sacrifice or limit the ability to make moves toward electrification in other parts of the economy. So, I think there is a real imperative, not just for equity and justice issues, but for decarbonization, that we find the lowest cost options and move sectors into those low cost options as quickly as we can.
We have one more question on equity, and after this, I'm going to ask Jesse, who organized this panel, to have a question or an observation. But the last question from the audience has to do with pollution hotspots. Is there evidence pointing to carbon pricing as generating pollution hotspots? This is another equity concern, not the overall income one. Or is that something which we don't have to worry about? Joe, do you want to start, and then, or shall I ask Danny?
Happy to speak on it. I think it is something to be concerned about, right? Building political coalitions means appealing to lots of these needs. My intuitive sense as a tax structure is better than a trading structure for pollution hotspots, but Suzi says no.
Okay, Suzi.
But I do think it needs to be taken seriously and credibly, and we could all do a better job trying to identify how the things we're proposing can set aside complementary measures to deal with pollution, those other pollution issues, at the same time.
Suzi?
I think the concern is a very real one, and it's clearly something that needs to be dealt with, and we haven't yet. The evidence, which is now growing, is that it's not in any place increasing pollution, which theory says that it should not. You're putting on more regulation everywhere. You're imposing more of a price everywhere, but they're not seeing the gains that they might hope to see in some of the worst places. And that's where the policy, I think, is falling down. And I wanted to agree with Danny that we've got a lot of evidence on the impacts of pricing policies on distribution and on co-benefits. We have very little on industrial policies. And so people, and they tend to be much less visible. So people tend to use that as a lever against pricing policies, where potentially industrial policies would have worse equity effects because the decisions around them are much less visible and much harder to understand what the equity implications are going to be. And so I'd be interested to know if there is an active political science literature in whether these policy choices, like between regulation and pricing, is actually likely to systematically affect the voice that environmental justice communities can have.
Well, this is a great panel, and it's going on. It's we're reaching the end point, and I want to give Jesse a chance. So let me thank the panelists for a wonderful discussion, very sophisticated and very straightforward and very, very illuminating, and give Jesse a chance to make a last observation or to ask a last question that he wants to offer.
Sure, I'll try to make it more of a question, but I guess I'll start with an observation, which is that much of the political critique of carbon pricing focuses on its salience and its impact on consumer prices. And of course, the necessary carbon price that we need to deliver emissions reductions that we need to address climate change is a function of the cost of abatement, and that itself is very dynamic, right? It's a product of innovation, and that innovation can be an order of magnitude over a decade in terms of the costs of mitigation for various solutions. So, we think about increasing carbon pricing over time, probably not by tenfold, and yet we've seen the cost of electric vehicle batteries and solar panels, just to name a couple of salient important pieces of the puzzle, fall by that order of magnitude, by 90% over the last 10 years. Much of the economics discussion around carbon pricing is focused on its static efficiency, right? Equilibrating prices on the margins in the near term. So I guess I'm curious if your reflections on the role of carbon pricing in long-term innovation, and how we think about that sort of dynamic interaction between innovation, making politics easier, making maybe carbon pricing easier, making innovation happen. What's sort of the feedback loop that might work there?
And maybe I'll comment briefly on that. One has to have a dynamic view of the interest groups here. Otherwise, it's static and the climate problem is really, really hard. So this is something that the trade world has been doing for decades, literally. And in part, what we're trying to do in this book is lay out what we think are the major moving parts to invite more of that in the political science world, to formalize some of these models, have other kinds of techniques and so on. I want to make one plug for the revenues that come from these systems, and a public finance plug. More public finance discipline to where these money flows, especially the money from cap and trade systems, because it tends to be treated in most systems as new money and not under the same public finance rules as tax revenues, would really help a lot on the politics, because it could be used actively to invest in innovations and new groups, and ultimately, in effect, creating new industries. That has to be done with care. It has to be done. The same disciplines applied regarding inequality have to be applied to industrial policy as are being applied to fiscal measures. But that's the agenda, and that will create a more dynamic view of the interest groups. And that, I think, is the real world, and also is a world which is much more hopeful about dealing with the climate problem than a static world.
Just to add really quickly, I think our view is that where you can create the politics, markets are really good at static efficiency. And we're skeptical that you can do that in very many places. And I'm personally deeply skeptical that it's been a key driver of those dynamic conditions. And Jesse, EVs, batteries, renewables. I mean, you remember 10 or 15 years ago, we started talking about this stuff. People would have thought you were going to be crazy if you said those things are going to be the dominant, technologies in the respective fields. I'll suggest to you that offsets and carbon pricing have had almost nothing to do with that change. Lots of other policies, including R&D, but including procurement mandates and regulatory standards, tell us the story there. We need to replicate those outcomes. We have a theory about why we think that replication is going to be primarily through non-pricing strategies.
Can I just add there that I think most of us would agree that carbon pricing doesn't have a large impact on the sort of complex R&D challenges that we face, but it can be really good in terms of the adoption once the technologies begin to become mature. And there's quite a lot of empirical evidence on that.
Maybe just a final observation there, that the carbon pricing, even if it drives innovation, tends to drive the most cost-effective things first, right? Which means we need additional policy to address those that are higher up in the abatement curve, so we can pull them down the cost curve over time. I don't think there's much controversy about that in the economics world either, but a key piece of the dynamic efficiency puzzle. Well, I think we're at the end of our time. Thank you all for such a wonderful conversation. I appreciate everybody helping put this together and joining us for the conversation. We're going to have students stick around for engagement with the panelists. And so if you're a student, you're interested in engaging in the student engagement section that follows, we'll have a short break. And please stick around in the webinar. We'll have our hosts promote you to attendee status so that you can, or from attendee to panelist status, so we can have a more, free-flowing conversation. And thanks to all of our public attendees for joining us. So a virtual round of applause for all of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Joe, I don't think you noticed, but I did you a little favor.
I definitely